Hello everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the Tatouchi Democracy Forum here at the Japanese American National Museum, which is part of our National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, which is, I think, incredibly relevant to what we'll be talking about today. Just want to give you a few quick logistical notes. The emergency exits are around the auditorium, illuminated by the signs. The one which you entered may not be the closest one that you came to, so in case of emergency, you just exit calmly via the stairs out to the lobby. The restrooms are also up on the second floor. You can take the stairs in here, or the stairs or elevator in the lobby up. And then we also ask that you do not eat or drink inside this space today and silence any electronic devices you may have. If you have any other questions about access, visiting today, you can talk to myself or any of my colleagues in the lobby, and we'd love to help you out. We'll also be selling the book that is on, we're discussing today in the lobby after the program, so you don't have to go far, and we'll be doing a signing as well as a few other items that celebrate Yuri's life that we have in the JANM store. And I want to give a final special thank you to all of our JANM members who are here in the audience today. Your support is what allows us to put on programming like this and allows us to keep going as a museum. You may have heard that our JANM is closed. We are not totally closed, of course, because we're still doing programs like this when we're launching our JANM on the Go initiative, while our main pavilion on the other side of the plaza is under construction until next year. We'll be launching a new core exhibition, a new way of thinking about our Japanese American story, as well as updated and renovated spaces to welcome you all back into. So while we are out on the go, we hope that you join us on the road, both here in Los Angeles and around the country, and keep in touch with us on our website and through social media, as well as in person. So we're really, it's a big change for us, but we're also really excited. It's an exciting opportunity and moment for us to grow and shift our work here at the museum. So if you have any questions about that as well, you can talk to us in the lobby. We'll actually be at La Plaza's down the street, the other museum's family, La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, their family festival tomorrow with a table. So continuing to stay engaged with the community, even if we don't have exhibitions here. So with that, I also want to say a huge thank you to the Yuri Kochiyama Solidarity Project for their support, and especially Yuri Kochiyama Holman, who is the one who really made this event happen today. So thank you so much, Audie, for starting off the email thread and getting in touch. The Yuri Kochiyama Solidarity Project's mission is to carry on Yuri's legacy, her passion for justice and commitment to connecting people, communities, and movements to each other in solidarity, which I think we can all agree is incredibly and desperately needed at this moment. So please follow their work and support them. And I know they're here today, and then also you'll be in Gardena JCI tomorrow. So if you didn't get enough today, you can go check out the program again tomorrow as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guests today. They're going to be talking more about the topic today, but Yuri Kochiyama and her legacy is so built into what we do here at the museum. She's featured prominently in our exhibitions and our work. When I first started working here, many people had a story about her visiting the museum and being involved. So it's really special that we get to bring the family here today and talk a little bit about her life and legacy. So with that, I'm going to introduce our two special guests today. First we have Naima Williams, who is a multidisciplinary writer and performing author of multiple poetry chapbooks, and of course the book today, The Bridges Yuri Built, How Yuri Kochiyama Marched Across Movements, published by Kaepernick Publishing. And she's also the co-founder of Eat at the Table Theater Company, and of course the great-granddaughter of Yuri Kochiyama. And she'll be joined in conversation by Lisa Ling, who is a journalist, contributor to CBS News, and longtime host and executive producer of This Is Life on CNN and Our America on OWN Network. When we said who should we bring in to be in conversation, Lisa's name came up very quickly, and so we're really grateful that she's here today. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kai.
Thank you all so much for coming out. I'm so happy to be here. Before I start, I just want to say thank you so much to Joy and to Elizabeth and my grandma Audie, of course. Everyone who just put in efforts to make this event happen. I so appreciate being in community with you. And of course, I also just want to express my gratitude to Lisa for being in conversation with me today. It's truly such an honor for me, and I'm such an admirer of your work, and I'm sure many people here are as well. So this is actually my second visit to the museum. I can only really vaguely recollect my first, but I think I would have been in middle school or even earlier. So it's very special to be back here in this capacity and on an occasion like this. So before we begin our conversation, I'm just going to read my author's note from the book. Growing up in the Kochiyama family, I often had the sense that my great-grandmother was known and loved by many, but I didn't fully appreciate the extent of her activism or her significance as a figure until she passed away. In fact, it was at her memorial service that I can first recall realizing the breadth of her impact. When Angela Davis took the stage to pay tribute, she called Yuri the person who can really change the world. And those words sparked a deep curiosity that continues to live within me to this day. I wanted to know why she was that person, and what made Grandma Yuri so special. As an organizer, Yuri is distinguished for her activism and for her personality. She was a committed storekeeper of information and an avid documentarian who photographed every action, kept records of every person she met, and preserved every piece of correspondence over decades of work. She's known for her scope and the depth of her beliefs, namely her commitment to seeking revolution, to have undergone such a dramatic transformation from her patriotic and politically ambivalent upbringing to her radical, anti-racist, anti-imperialist ideology in adulthood, indicated that she was a true believer in the causes she supported, and that her consciousness was constantly evolving with new understanding. She was steadfast in her values, but open to change within her own beliefs, and most notably, she was invested in the pursuit of liberation for all oppressed peoples, and her advocacy was never limited to challenging the racism she experienced as an Asian American woman, but extended to all kinds of communities. For Yuri, solidarity was not an ideal, but an embodied necessary practice. Throughout her life, Yuri supported many movements. She was affiliated with the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, the Republic of New Africa, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, amongst countless other organizations. She personally supported and advocated on behalf of political prisoners, including Matiari Shabaka Sundiata, Yu Kikumura, Marilyn Buck, Lolita Lebron, Leonard Peltier, Mumia Abu-Jamal, and Assata Shakur. Her activism took her across the country and the world, from riding in a U-Haul truck to Mississippi with the citizens of the Republic of New Africa in 1971, to participating in the 1977 takeover of the Statue of Liberty with Puerto Rican independentistas, to demand the release of prisoner Andre Cordero, to traveling to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade in 1987, to visiting Peru, Japan, and the Philippines in the early 1990s on human rights missions. She was a critical advisor in the Asian American movement and, alongside her husband, Bill, helped to organize for reparations for the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, which granted $20,000 to each Japanese American internment survivor. Yuri cited the act to advocate for reparations for Black American descendants of enslaved people. And she continued to reference Japanese American experiences during World War II when speaking out against racial profiling towards Muslims, South Asians, and Middle Easterners in the United States post 9/11. Making connections between movements and identifying common sources of oppression remained a crucial component of her work until the very end of her life. And when I meet people who knew Yuri, and even those who only encountered her once, I'm struck by how often they repeat the same sentiments. They tell me she made them feel heard and cared for, that she always remembered them, that she received them with kindness, respect, and genuine interest. Yuri's ability to personally connect with people from all walks of life and to bring communities together despite differences to achieve common goals is part of what makes her such a beloved and unique figure. Those connections are the bridges Yuri built and the legacy she leaves behind. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling out there? Great, thank you all so much. Amazing for taking the time out of your busy day and weekend to be with us today. It brings me so much honor to be in conversation with Kai. I have for many, many years had such an insatiable appetite for knowing everything that I can about your great-grandmother, Yuri Kochiyama, and it's a particular honor to be in the presence of Audie and Jimmy and members of the Kochiyama family here today. So let's get right into it. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
On this beautiful book. Kai's going to be doing a signing afterwards, and if you haven't gotten a chance to read the book, it is so beautiful and provocative. What compelled you to want to write this book, and why a picture book?
Yeah, well, it was actually a really interesting turn of events because it was sort of an opportunity that kind of fell into my lap, and not one that I concocted myself. The story is that in May of 2020, on my grandma Yuri's, I think what would have been her 99th birthday, which incidentally she shares with Malcolm X, and actually like a host of other revolutionary figures. So it's an auspicious day. May 19th.
May 19th.
So I just decided to put out like a thread on Twitter saying, this would have been my great-grandmother's 99th birthday, this is who she was, and I included, links to various articles and essays and just little bits of media about her, and so that tweet thread went viral, and then the next day an editor approached me in my DMs, and she'd seen that I was a writer, and she said that there was kind of like a surprising void in, because she worked specifically on historical children's nonfiction, and she was talking about how no one had written Yuri's story into a format that was designated and designed for children, and would I be maybe interested in considering that, and I was. But it was, a challenge for me because I never intended to write for a child audience. I write fiction and poetry for adults. So it was, a challenging assignment and a labor of love. But I will say that I think a children's book and a picture book was the perfect medium and vessel for her story. I think that her story is kind of uniquely well suited for young people because I think she exemplifies the way that someone of any age, people of all ages, can at any moment pivot into participating in social justice and engaging in social change. And I think that her story can be inspiring but also activating for children. I really wanted to make sure that I wrote about her as a child, about how, long before she was an activist, she was an active member of her community. She was like a volunteer, a Girl Scout. She was a student journalist for her paper. She loved participating in community and community building, and all of those parts of her personality and activities that she engaged in as a kid, those were the same practices that she implemented in her activism after she'd been radicalized. So I really think she sets an example of how to be an active, engaged person, even when you're a child, even when you don't have the agency of adulthood or before you're formally educated. So I'm glad that I was able to tell that story to young audiences, and I hope that they can take something from her example.
I love that idea of introducing young people and kids to this idea that one can pivot, and even in a way that is so extreme in some cases, because your great-grandmother, Yuri, was actually born Mary Yuriko Nakahama, and she grew up as American as apple pie.
Very much so.
And it wasn't until her family was sent to an internment camp that she was suddenly surrounded by more Japanese people than she'd ever experienced before. And in what way would you say that experience in camp and what happened to her father, if you could touch on that, almost shattered her perception of America? Because again, Mary was as American as apple pie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's it is such a the moment of the camps and the killing of her father, which I'll explain momentarily, absolutely, I think, shattered her perception of America. I think also her sense of identity as an American citizen who considered herself to be all American, and also shattered her perception of reality. Her father was a fishing merchant, essentially, and he, like many Japanese immigrant men in their community, they grew up in San Pedro, were surveilled for years, actually, before Pearl Harbor, on the suspicion that he was feeding information or trading information to the Japanese government, that he was a spy. The day of Pearl Harbor, Yuri was home, and FBI agents came and forcibly took her father. They did not tell the family where they were taking him, and they tortured him and imprisoned him. And then when he was returned to their family weeks later, he'd been denied his medication. He just had had surgery, and he could not recognize them. And then he died, I think, the next day or shortly thereafter. So, and then very soon after that, they were displaced. And it's really, it's interesting because I think she was, if you look at her journals from that time, she was full of sorrow and grief, and of course, absolutely not understanding what was happening, and yet she never expresses anger. I think it took her a long time to process and to direct any blame. I think that she knew that it was racially motivated, that, you know, what was happening to the Japanese Americans, but I think she did not know yet. I think she was so full of questioning that it creates the impetus in her to seek answers. And I think that is like the most important turning point, because up until then, she had no understanding, no comprehension of the way that racism systemically worked in the United States and why. So this is the first time that she's understanding that she is not considered the same as white Americans. And I think it's the incentive in her to seek answers and to understand why that is happening to her, and also going through this experience that then enables her to fully understand why she wants to support initially Black Americans in the civil rights movement.
Even while she was in camp, the
yes,
injustice of it hadn't been fully realized.
Yeah, it hadn't been fully realized. I think part of the reason she did not, or maybe was suppressing her rage or her ability to access feelings of anger is because she grew up very religious too. I think she had this idea that one should take responsibility for oneself and try not to blame others, and also I think an unwillingness to want to complain or wallow in her own suffering when others are in need. And I think that that's part of why, because she always record kept, so she would write about, you know, her sorrow and her, you know, not wanting to leave her friends and not understanding. But I think there are kind of moments in that where you can tell she's suppressing other feelings, and I think it takes her a long time to get to a place of anger that's productive and that allows her to contribute.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there was probably a cultural component to that for her and a lot of people at that time. Tell us about the young soldier that she met in camp, who would eventually become your great-grandfather, Bill Kochiyama.
Yes.
Tell us what you know of your great-grandfather, Bill.
Yeah, so you know, I never personally met Bill. Yuri I knew growing up, but Bill died before I was born, so I didn't know that much about him. I know that he was a New Yorker, and he's the reason that Yuri and my family moved to New York, so I guess he's also the reason that I'm from New York. And I knew that they loved each other very much. And they met in the camps, and she was madly in love with him. And so I think, you know, he is a really integral part of the story as well. I also think he's he seems to me to be a very interesting person too, because I think they must have had a pretty unconventional relationship, in which, in the ways that he supported her, especially considering that Yuri didn't get into movement work. She didn't enter movements until she was middle-aged and had 6 children. So, and you know, it's not that she was ever a housewife. They both worked, but I think they probably had like a more traditional marriage and, you know, family life. And then in the 60s, she makes this drastic life change that also pulls him and the rest of their family into like just a very different kind of life, and also endangers them. And in the book, I write about how when they would give shelter to anyone who sought refuge, it could be, you know, activists who were made fugitives. It could also just be anyone who was in need of, you know, a bed and a place to stay. When there were too many people in the apartment, Yuri would sleep in the crib and Bill would sleep in the bathtub. So I think that it's really interesting because Yuri is an extraordinary person, and I think Bill also seems to me to be quite extraordinary too, in the way that he supported and embraced the endeavors that she took up. Yeah, that completely changed their lives. You know, and she was the front-facing person, so I think he, in some ways, had to, you know, take a step back.
I want to get to that, their domicile, because it really became this nucleus and haven for so many activist activities. But before that, I want to go back to when they were in camp. They spend a number of years in the internment camp, and when they are released, they end up going to New York, because that's where Bill was from, and settling in Harlem. And why did Harlem have such an impact on her and really start planting the seeds for her eventual radicalism.
Yeah. I think when I was conceptualizing the book, the two of the biggest turning points that I was thinking was first in the camps, the experience of the camps and the action that she participates in the camps. And then the second is the move to Harlem, which was her entry into movements. And it begins with two things. It begins with her sort of consciousness of their positionality in Harlem. They are, I think, the only Asian family that they know in the neighborhood and in their housing project. So she's very cognizant off rip that she wants to contribute, that she's aware of the fact that they're living in a place that is not necessarily for them. And so through her willingness and desire to connect with her community, she starts becoming interested in what people are doing there and what's happening there, is mobilizing and organizing and people talking about the movements. And then it's also through her children that she becomes radicalized into Harlem's epicenter of movement work at the time, because she, the schools at the time were, of course, under-resourced and underfunded, and there were also, there was a lot of talk of the sort of dangerous roads and streets where there was a lack of infrastructure. So I think particularly something that kickstarted her entry into this work was that there was like a certain street where there wasn't a stoplight, and I think some children had been killed. So one of the first demonstrations she ever attends is through an organization she joined called the Harlem Parents Committee, and again, she's joining because she has children in the neighborhood. And the Harlem Parents Committee had created this, organized this demonstration where they would go and they would sit in the road and have a sit-in and fight for better infrastructure. And that, I believe, is the first real action she attends. And from there, I think she just catches the bug. So I think she just, in wanting to contribute, in wanting to be a part of the community, and wanting
to... It seems like it's really the first time outside of camp, because I think, as we said earlier, it didn't seem like she really realized the egregious injustice that was happening in camp, and then she moves to Harlem, and then she sees it happening all around her in another community, and that's really what inspires her to, or ignites that fuel of activism.
Right, and it gives some of those answers. They begin to provide the answers that she starts having questions about in the camps, about racism and about the state and the way these injustices are legalized and intended. So she learns from others, and it's not really until she gets to Harlem that she starts to connect with and make friends with Black Americans and starts to understand their lives and their struggles. And then also there's this, there are all these incredible resources for her to get involved and get educated. So she started going to a freedom school, and that's how she begins to learn about Black American history, protest movements, and the civil rights movement as it's percolating and beginning to really happen.
Now let's go back to the apartment, because I just always have found that that space so interesting. I mean, it really became this haven for so much activity, and as you said, for people to come stay if they didn't have anywhere else to stay, so much so that she and Bill would sleep in the bathtub or on the floor. Tell us about some of the things that went on in that apartment.
Yeah, well, something that they're kind of famous for is Yuri and Bill would throw these Saturday night open houses So they were essentially like parties, but you know, as you mentioned, it's a hub for networking as well. So they throw these gatherings every weekend, and anyone is invited to attend. So a lot of the time that means activists and freedom fighters, but it's also a lot of artists. Yuri loved artists and entertainers, so it's actors and musicians and writers, and if you are an entertainer, you're going to entertain at these open houses, so she has people perform. People are there to connect with one another and to network and to give speeches, and it does become this hub. It does become this place also where people could access safe harbor. And eventually activists start calling it Grand Central Station because thousands of people came and passed through while they lived there.
Including a well-known visitor who happened to pop by one evening.
Yes.
Can you tell us about her, the first time Malcolm X
Yes,
dropped by
absolutely.
the apartment?
Yeah, so Malcolm actually came she had invited him to speak to victims of the Hiroshima bombings who were visiting Harlem. And when he gave word that he would attend, I mean, he was the Kochiyama's hero. And of course, you know, it was such a exciting and incredible moment for the neighborhood and for their building. As many people as they could possibly pack into the apartment came to hear him speak. And when he came, he spoke to them about essentially cross-racial solidarity, and he was speaking particularly to warn them about the Vietnam War, which was upcoming, and to implore Black Americans not to enlist. And he talked about how the struggle of what he called the Third World was the same struggle as Black Americans. I think something that Yuri appreciated and probably developed her own consciousness through was how clearly he could draw a link between the racism imposed by the United States onto Black Americans and U.S. imperialism in Asian countries. And so when he spoke to the victims of the bombings, he said, you are scarred and we are scarred by the effects of racism. And it was, I think, just such a affecting and powerful moment for Yuri. And then shortly thereafter, they continued to correspond while he was traveling to Mecca.
How do you think Yuri's interaction with Malcolm X incited in some ways her own liberation?
Yeah, I think he completely altered the trajectory of her life. I mean, she was already participating. She was on that path. She was certainly on that trajectory, but I think that he meant the world to her. I think she was so inspired by his courage, by his resistance and his love of people, his community. It always really bothered her when people had a perception of him as kind of motivated by a hatred or a destructive rage, because she saw him as someone who loved his people and his community so much. That's what she told him when they met. And so I think he inspired her so much. I think he also, again, that the way that he could outline the importance of solidarity, I think really informed what she believed. So he inspired her. I think the fact that he corresponded with her, so much of her practice, so much of what makes her unique as a figure, are the practices of care she implemented, and one of them was correspondence, and that goes back to her childhood, that goes back to the camps. Letter writing was very significant for her. It's the way that she supported political prisoners. It's the way that she was able to kind of contribute and prove her what the support that she could offer in movements early on, before people kind of knew what she was doing. She would write letters. So I think the fact that he wrote to her meant a lot to her as well. And then of course, when he was martyred and she was there, and I think, and held him as he lay dying, I think his loss absolutely ignited her to continue on and try to take up his work. I think the loss of him really changed her life as well. And she wrote about him as this North Star, this shining ideal of what an activist could be. So I think she tried to follow in his image.
I think one of the perennial questions when it comes to Yuri and Malcolm is always how would you define their relationship?
Right.
You want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is the right word, but I think she was like kind of a disciple of his. I think that they did get to a place of being friends. I read last year when I was in California doing other book promotion, I found like a little sentence in Diane Vigino's Heartbeat of Struggle, which is a biography of Yuri's that I religiously pored over while I was writing the book. And I'd never seen this sentence before though, and he had written to her at one point and said, "I think you have the most beautiful family in Harlem." So I think that they did have a real friendship at some point, but I think he was her hero. And I do think that they had an exchange and that they learned from each other, but she really, I think, just worshipped him as an activist.
What role would Yuri go on to play in the movement for Black Power?
Mm-hmm. I think she was just a great support, but the support was engaged, it was active, it was not ideological, it was practical, and she gave every resource she had. I mean, she put herself and her family on the line. She gave everything she possibly could in service to Black liberation movements. She would never consider herself like a leader, but I think she was, she provided real committed support and not allyship. She was not supporting from the position of an ally, which is the position of a privileged person reaching out to help marginalized or disempowered communities. She was truly a comrade, and that is why so many of those organizations and so many of those people entrusted her and embraced her in spaces in which she was often the only Asian person, almost always the only Asian woman, and was a sister. I mean, they considered her a sister. She ended up becoming part of these organizations, really being an active member, being invited in on the strength of the fact that she was really a true supporter, and her motivations were just solely to be in service, and people recognized that because she was so persistent in the work. So I think her role was one of support, but that was a real job that required everything.
I mean, when you talk to so many Black activists, with frequency you hear about Sister Yuri, because she was such an integral part of the movement. We use this term radical to describe your grandmother, a great-grandmother. Do you think that there was one moment, or do you think it was a series of moments that actually led to her flipping that switch and becoming that radical that she became?
Right. Yeah, I think it was gradual, but it is interesting that she starts in a completely opposite place than she ends up. I think that is an interesting kind of part of the story, is that she was so aligned with the ideal of America, and then she becomes like towards not even the end of her life, but the middle of her life, she's engaged in dismantling the American empire. I think it was a series of changes, but I also think that she always had a very strong sense of what she believed was just, always had a very strong sense of right and wrong, and I think it was just once she educates herself and once she becomes more and more informed about the struggles and about racism and imperialism, once she learns, she's kind of ready. She knows that she wants to fight back, and it really is just once she gets kind of the tools and the resources and the education to do so. So I think there's also something that was just always inherent in her, which is, I think, speaks to the kind of extraordinary person that she was.
I want to get personal for a minute. You got to know your great-grandmother quite well, but what kind of presence would you say that she had over your life as a young person?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think when I was younger, she moved to California when I was a kid. So for most of what I can remember, we would see her like once a year. And it was long before I had any sense of like who she was as a figure. I just remember, we would see her very intermittently, but I do remember her always being just like a very warm person, very curious, very engaged, always wanted to know what me and my brother were up to, and
Try to indoctrinate you as a kid.
No, not at all. It was I mean, the only thing she tried to do was make us perform, which I was very happy to do as a kid. She loved when her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would perform for her. So that I would do. But I do remember, even though to me she was just like my great-grandma, I do remember having a sense that she was important, because when my grandma would throw like family reunions, which were really just gatherings of like everybody we knew and not just our family, at her home in Oakland, people would gravitate around her. Like I remember seeing her, like in a chair with her walker, and she was always a very humble person, like in stature too. So it would just be all of these people kind of constantly around her, and everyone wanted to talk to her and like have a moment to have an exchange with her. So I think I had a conception that she was like this matriarchal force, but I didn't have any sense of like why that was until I was growing up and starting to engage, and then that was just a very interesting process of like revelations about the fact that she was this radical figure, but I had no idea as a kid.
When did the breadth of her persona and all that she was involved in, when did that really set in for you? And in some ways, how did that contribute to how you started to define yourself and define your own values?
Yeah, absolutely, it did. I think there were kind of like 2 points that I can remember quite clearly, at which I started to understand that she was this revolutionary figure. The first being, I remember in 6th grade, reading her memoirs for the first time, and it was that I was reading them. It was coinciding with the civil rights unit that we were learning in 6th grade. So I remember being really like entrenched in these images of the protests, the demonstrations, watching like Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, the documentary series, and at the same time that I'm like being very affected too by the violence, you know, watching protesters at the Greensboro counters be attacked, and watching, you know, the footage from Selma and people being attacked with dogs and hoses, and then at the same time that I'm uncovering this history, I'm understanding that she was a part of it, and I'm reading it kind of in her words, and so it was really hard to reconcile the images that I was seeing with the idea that she was there, or sometimes there, sometimes in New York.
Which is why this book for young people is
Right.
so essential, because as most of us in this room know, American history is told in such a binary kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very hard to picture someone like her, especially because in my head I'm thinking about my great-grandma who's like in her 80s or 90s at that point. So that was just like very stark for me, but then also I didn't really have any true sense of the scope of her her revolutionary nature until her memorial, and I remember that very vividly because there were like maybe 1,000 folks, and the way that people spoke about her, and her courage and her steadfastness and her conviction was like truly astonishing to me. And I don't think that I remember being very taken aback by the level of emotion, and also like her memorial kind of turned into a demonstration at points. Like people were there making.
Of course it would. It's Yuri
Of
Kochiyama's
course. And they were making political statements, and the feeling of it was kind of the feeling of being like in a protest with thousands of people, and just that energy, the amount of energy there that she inspired in people, I think just completely took me aback. And it was from there on that people would tell me stories of like these crazy actions she participated in, and it wasn't really until then. And I guess I'll also just say really quickly that you know, there are kind of few renowned Asian American activists, and I think even fewer who are aligned with and known for their allegiance to Black liberation. So I think once I started understanding that too, in either academic contexts or just you know, through reading, I think that was also another moment that I understood like how unique she was.
I'm going to open the floor for questions in a couple of minutes, but Kai, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you if you could give us your thoughts on what you think your great-grandmother would have thought about these times in which we are living. Because as scary as it is to think about, there are some really concerning parallels.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, I think I can tell you what I believe she would feel and what she would be doing. I know she would be horrified at the political climate, what feels like a regression, and also a perpetuation of the forces that she fought against her entire life. I know she would be inflamed and activated, and that she would be doing everything in her power to fight against the genocide of the Palestinian people, to work towards a free Palestine, that is free from Israeli occupation. I know that she would be speaking up against the illegal deportations and detainments of people and the invocation of the same powers that incarcerated her people to do the same today. I know that she would be actively encouraging and standing with student protesters in Harlem, at Columbia, and across the country, and that she would probably be with them on those front lines. So, I mean, of course, it's times like this that I wish we could access her guidance, but I hope also that we can take strength and instruction from the ways that she fought and that her comrades fought, because they were fighting the same forces that we are today.
Before I open the floor, what characteristics of your great-grandmother would you say live on in you?
Oh gosh. I hope so much to embody the values that she passed down through my family. I think I am curious about people the way that she was, and I hope too that I'm able to maybe not to the extent she did, but I want to speak truth to power in the way that she did. And also I think that because I grew up in her family, I always had a very strong sense of what I believed to be right and wrong, and a real impetus to fight for what I believe in. So I think that's definitely something I inherited from her through also the other members of my family, and I hope that I can carry on that legacy and be like her. I would love to be in personality the way she was and to make people feel the way that she made them feel, because I think that is one of the most incredible things about her, was really about, those character things, those characteristics. So I'd like to be able to take those up as well.
I think you're on that road.
Thank you.
Does anyone, Joy, you're going to pass that mic around? Anybody have any questions? We've got one up here. This young woman in the pink.
Thank you so much for your book. I mean, I felt some real inspiration from your great-grandmother. In some ways, some parallels to my life. I was in Jerome, just like she was. I was inspired by the autobiography of Malcolm X. I was a college student, and I was just getting ready to start my teaching career. But he changed my life. My whole world was so sheltered. After reading his book, it just like opened the world to me. And I gained so much inspiration from him, and I gained so much inspiration from your great-grandmother. I've read her book, read your book. It's the best way to start with children. And I'm reading her biography right now, which is also inspiring. But I think we as Japanese Americans, we sit in silence too much. Right now, there's such a strong parallel between the Aliens Enemies Act and how this current administration is applying that. And that was the exact same act that was used against us and made them think they could do what they did. And so many times I listen to the television and I listen to newscasters and everything like that. They insist on calling them Japanese internment camps. These were not Japanese internment camps. They were U.S. concentration camps that incarcerated American citizens. That's the message we all have to get out. I call my congresswoman every day and impress upon her how important it is to get this message out. They took down the 442 in the DOD.
I saw that, yeah.
I mean, what, you know, that's my call in the morning, Monday morning. You know, but we have to get active. We can't be silent. We're silent too long. So you have, and I went to my Congresswoman's town hall meeting. I expressed these same things. So thank you so much, because this is so timely. It's very timely that we get your great-grandmother's activism started today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. What is your name?
Marion Yoshiki Kovanik.
So nice
My
to meet
maiden
you.
name
Thank
is
you.
Yoshiki.
Thank you for that. Completely agreed.
I love that you call your congressperson every day. That's impressive. We have work to do, folks.
Kai, you just blow my mind. This is so wonderful. But I want to take a little curve because we have Audie here and Jimmy. And you, Lisa, you were asking about how it was at the apartment when Malcolm came. And so I want to just put Audie and Jimmy on the spot because you were there. Just if you could talk about the impact of when he visited that night, or how you felt about all these people traipsing in and out of your home, and because you were there.
Yeah, I was about 16 when he came, and my mother had just met the Japanese American Hibachi, a journalist, and the one person they wanted to meet in the United States was Malcolm X, so she put out an invitation to him, but didn't know whether he was going to show up or not. And when he came to the door with his, I think he had a security person, he was so, my mother was so excited, and then he was so humble. I used to, maybe 2 or 3 times I'd gone to hear him speak at the Audubon Ballroom with my mom, and he's just an amazing figure, so articulate, and so, but not having the opportunity to meet him in person, to be introduced. And he was so kind to me as a teenager, and there were about 2 or 3 other young girls there too, and we took a picture together, and I asked for his autograph, and he said, "I hope that you grow up to make this a better world for all people." And so it's a beautiful statement, and it was just that, and then unfortunately, actually, that day, one of our friends who is a adult activist, and for some reason he thought, rather than have the whole family there, he said, "Oh, I'll take your kids to see a movie." I think it was Mary Poppins or something. And so then my mom at the last minute said I could stay and I could, help, serve food or whatever. So I was lucky. I was the only one of the kids who was able to be there when he came. But I just never forget his kindness, and he was so humble and just. It wasn't like what you read in the paper. They made him seem like he was this terrible figure, but I knew how much our whole family admired him, and it was just sometimes you meet someone who's famous and they're kind of disappointing when you meet them in person, but he was the exact opposite, that you could see he was such a leader, but he was just humble. He wasn't about himself, and he was trying to listen to people, and it was something I'll always remember.
So I want to ask you, one, I had the privilege of meeting both your great-grandmother and her brother Peter, who I interviewed for the Hanashiro History Program. So I want to share a short story with you before I ask my question. That was that having interviewed a lot of World War II JA veterans, 2 names always came up when they talked about Camp Shelby, and that was Yuri Kochiyama and Mary Nakahara. How wonderful they were, how greeting they were, that they'd always remember your name even after meeting you once. So no matter what a small community you came from, you felt like you had this friend. It took us 2 years before we realized they were one and the same person. So, and my question for you is, Yuri had spoken about the price she paid being such an activist in the Black community before being realized as the activist she became in the Japanese American community. Could you speak to that price that she paid initially, the backlash that was put on her?
Well, that's really interesting. I'm not like familiar with that particular framing of it. I do know that it was very difficult for her to integrate herself into the movement initially because she was a Japanese American woman. So I wonder if that's what she meant by the backlash, that sort of tricky navigation into becoming a person that could be entrusted. I think because, for good reason, it was very difficult to get into those spaces and to be welcomed in. Yeah.
I'd like to clarify. Actually, what I was getting at was that she talked about because she was so active in the Black community, that she got some criticism for not using that same energy
towards the
Japanese
Asian American movement.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
got it. From other Asian people?
Japanese, actually, in particular, Japanese American community.
Oh, that is fascinating. Well, that's really interesting because I haven't necessarily heard that, but I think could see that criticism coming towards her. And I do think it's like kind of an interesting trajectory that she begins her career and her life as an activist by supporting Black liberation movements, and then there's a turning point in which she does start to she becomes a person that I think is positioned as a leader in the Asian American movement, because when young Asian American students and people are starting to learn from Black liberation movements, and they want to have their own activist spaces to develop a sense of identity that is divorced from the ideal of how Asians are positioned in America to serve white supremacy and to serve Western interests. I think those young people know of her as an activist for Black liberation efforts, and so they sort of automatically go to her for learning. And I think so many of those like Asian American movements in the 70s and 80s are so directly inspired by Black movements. So I'd like to look into that more to understand like who was critiquing her for maybe the ideas that she should be speaking for people of her own race before others. But so many of those movements, of those Asian American movements, whether it's for Asian American studies or artistic movements, they come after the fact of Black power movements, Black art movements, movements for Black studies, and they're inspired by them. So I think it's a very natural trajectory. But yeah, that's interesting, and I'll want to look into that more as well.
Well, just following that, because she really was a role model for a lot of us, and I think that I think I've come to the understanding now in terms of the Black movement that it's always been the leading edge. I mean, it was before, but even so now in terms of Black reparations. And I do want to say that I think your great-grandmother is part of the activism in our community, and I don't buy into this thing that we are quiet and that because we have a lot of activism historically from the first generation to now. She stands out definitely, but I think that our history, our community has a long history of activism. So I don't want to buy the image that we are not active, we are quiet, because we're not, and we're stopped. That quietness is stopped, I think. But question I did have was, I think there was a story about her going to the South with, I think maybe your great-grandfather, and being exposed to some experiences there that opened her eyes as well. Isn't that right? Or Do you know those stories?
Yes. Well, I do know that there's a period because she was incarcerated in Jerome, Arkansas. So I this part of her history is a little bit murky for me, the timeline of it. But I do think that she starts to understand a little bit about the way that Black American soldiers are differentiated because she understands that the Nisei soldiers are also kind of siloed and treated in a specific way. But she and Bill did visit, I think, Mississippi a few times. I don't know what particularly you're referencing, but they would go, I think, especially kind of at the beginning of her work and movements, because so much of what was happening with the civil rights movement was popping off in the South. So there were times that she, I think, made many visits with other like freedom fighters and organizations to be a part of what was happening, and I think particularly Mississippi, but other places as well. And her children too. I mean, my grandma Audie was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she met my grandfather right in the South doing that work. So I think there were many times that some of the most egregious violence against freedom fighters and against activists was happening in the South. So I'm sure that just sort of she witnessed that as she traveled there to do that work.
We have a little bit more time. We have one up here.
Hi. Back in the 80s, I had a chance to take my first trip to New York City. And it was to visit my friend Greg Morizumi, who had been an activist in the Bay Area. And I think he was one of the most strongest influences on me participating in the movement. Anyway, he had moved to New York City to organize there, and he was working in a Japanese restaurant with Eddie. I'm not sure whether he's your uncle or your dad or grandfather.
My uncle. We call him Uncle.
But anyway, so, Greg was gracious enough to take me around and stuff, and one Saturday night at the busiest Japanese restaurant in New York City off of Times Square, Eddie and Greg were working at, and it was like a crazy busy Saturday night, but I had the honor and privilege of eating sushi for like 3 hours with Atala Shabazz, one of Malcolm's daughters. But anyway, so a few days later, he said, "Oh, we got to go to Yuri and Bill's place, meet up with Eddie." And all I can say was like one of the most astounding meetings that I've ever met of a person. I mean, Yuri just opens up this space that when you enter, you just feel loved, you just feel welcome, and it was just amazing. And of course, Bill was there too. I think even Audie was there. But anyway, the amazing thing is that almost 10 years later, and I hadn't stayed in touch with Yuri. I wish I had, understood and knew about the letter writing, which is, I think, something that we should all re-embrace and forget about the social media stuff, and it would be a much better way to communicate. But anyway, so 10 years later, I go to some event, I forget where it was either in the Bay Area or here, and I saw Yuri, so I wanted to say hello, and immediately she knew my name. She remembered me after millions of people, and she just treated me like, family. I just can never forget that kind of hospitality.
Yeah.
So my question is, in terms of all their letters, are they being looked at and being published in some form?
Yes. First of all, that's an amazing story. I love hearing stories like that. I do think that is such a remarkable characteristic of hers, that she was able to do that and really meant it too. The store keeping ability, the record keeping ability, her memory is just absolutely remarkable. But yes, so I was very lucky. I've gotten to do some work with the Yuri Kochiyama Solidarity Project, which is my family's project that is oriented around preserving her legacy and continuing it as well. So I've been able to kind of look through her archives, and they are stored at various universities. So
Are they open to the public, Kai? Can you
Yes.
get access to them?
Columbia and UCLA.
Columbia and
Yeah.
UCLA.
and they're digitized to some extent, right?
Yeah.
So they are accessible. Some of them are accessible online. And again, there's like maybe 100 boxes of all of her correspondence, all of her letters. I'll also just say really quickly, I know we're running out of time, something I didn't know about her was that she kept, she photographed every single action that she was ever a part of, and not just actions, but activities, gatherings, just anything she went to. She had these little, not Polaroids, but these little film cameras, just the Kodak ones. So I had to go through and help my aunt organize them. There are just boxes and boxes and boxes of these photo packs that she took, and they're beautiful photos, really great portraiture, and just moments from Harlem and from all of these protests, and also with so many different people, and she wrote down who the people are. So in doing some of that process of helping my grandma and my aunt archive, I've been able to go through and just see some of these, and she's not in many of the photos because she's taking them. She didn't necessarily like to be in front of a camera very often, but it's so interesting to kind of see all of that through her eyes. So yes, the letters and her photos and the postcards from Malcolm, they've been preserved and to some extent are accessible either in person or digitally, but we're working to make them public.
Oh, I think we're about at time. I just wanted to offer, if any of the kids in the room or the young folks want to ask a question, I want to make sure that you have space for that. Or if you're too shy, that's okay too. But... Okay, cool.
That's
Sounds good.
okay. You can come talk to me when we do the signing if you want. Yeah, if you have any questions then.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Kai, for being with us today. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here. And Kai will be signing books out in the auditorium.
Thank
Right
you.
now. Thank you all so much.
Can we have one more round of applause for Kai and Lisa together here today?